Very good evening to all of you. On behalf of Speaking for Margin, I welcome all of you to the book discussion series 2023 started by Speaking for Margin. So I'll briefly introduce about the initiative and then I'll hand over to Ganesh to lead the session. So, Speaking from Margin is an academic platform for research scholars, social political activists, and students to engage with contemporary discourse in social sciences. It attempts at building academic solidarities for achieving social justice in higher education. We use this space to build solidarity among researchers from various marginal locations to engage with evolving knowledge paradigms within social sciences. In the past, we have organized several lectures and book discussion which have received overwhelming responses from the academic community and beyond. Our past speakers include Professor Kancha Ilaya, Professor Rajiv Bhargav, Professor Satish Deshpande, Professor Nandini Sundar, Professor Soumyavrat Chaudhary, Professor Joya Hassan, Dr. Nasreen Chaudhary, Dr. Rahul Burma, Professor Neera Chandok, Professor Narender Kumar, Dr. Sudhir Kumar Suthar, Professor Maitri Chaudhary, Professor Anita Abi, and Dr. Sohini Guha, among others. Through our Margin Speaks Books Discussion Series 2023, we try to bring our audience and participants to opportunity to interact with experts from different locations, social sciences and disciplines, with the objective of facilitating aspiring researchers and getting a better hold of contemporary debates in social sciences. And for this session, we have with us Ganesh to moderate the session. I'll briefly introduce Ganesh. Ganesh is a doctoral candidate at the Center for Political Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University. He holds a Master in Philosophy degree from the Department of Political Science, University of Delhi. His research focuses on political philosophy, caste, identity, emotion, and politics. He is a contributing author to Economic and Political Weekly and various editorial and op-ed for prominent Odia newspaper like Samaja. So Ganesh, over to you to lead the session. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you Vidyasagar for such an amazing introduction. So I would like to welcome our beloved audience again to this book discussion series. To discuss and understand more on the book, The Social Life of Democracy, we are having the author of the book, Professor Sundar Sarukkai. Sundar Sarukkai work is primarily in the philosophy of the natural and social sciences. He is the founder of Barefoot Philosophers, an initiative to take philosophy to students and the general public. He is the author of the following books: Translating the World, Science and Language, Philosophy of Symmetry, Indian Philosophy and the Philosophy of Science, What is Science, J.R.D. Tata and the Ethics of Philanthropy, and two books co-authored with Gopal Guru, The Cracked Mirror, an Indian Debate on Experience and Theory, and Experience, Caste and the Everyday Social. His most recent book, which we were going to discuss, The Social Life of Democracy. His book, Philosophy for Children, Thinking, Reading and Writing, has been translated into Tamil, Telugu, Malayalam, Kannada and Hindi. He is the series editor of Routledge Science and Technology Studies, as well as the co-chief editor of the Springer Handbook on Logical Thought in India. Welcome, Professor Sarukkai. And we have Professor Narender Kumar for the discussant and chair of the session. Professor Kumar is professor and chairperson at the Center for Political Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University, New Delhi. His research areas include Indian politics, politics of marginalized groups, and public policy. He is the author of more than 7 books and writes many research papers in various journals. He has edited the book Dr. Ambedkar and Democracy with Christophe Jaffrelot and In Search of Inclusive Policy, Addressing Graded Inequality with Sukhdev Thorat, Politics and Religion in India. It's his recent book. He is an academic referee for different publications that are Oxford University Press, Routledge, Sage, and Nature Springer. Professor Kumar has written the book with Jaffrelot, that is Dr. B.R. Ambedkar and Democracy. So I think he would be a pertinent one for today's discussion of the current book. Since Speaking from Margin is a student-driven forum, we are eager to listen to Sundar's personal motivations and experience. What tends to him for writing this book at this juncture? How can a researcher deal with the idea of democracy in a refreshing way, since the idea of democracy has become a buzzword? The basic concept in this book has been drawn from Ambedkar's idea of social democracy. So there are lots of questions arise like how is his idea in the book distinctive from Ambedkar's imagination of democracy, and what are his own methodological take which enable us to cultivate the idea of democracy amongst the public in everyday society in India. So I am not taking too much time. I would like to invite Professor Kumar. So the format of the discussion would be like first introductory remarks by Professor Kumar for 3 to 5 minutes. Then Professor Sundar Sarukkai will speak for 30 to 40 minutes. And again, Professor Kumar will give his concluding remarks around 15 minutes. Then we have our question answer session with the audience. Okay, thank you, Professor Kumar. So now I would like to hand over it.
Yeah, thank you, Ganesh, and thanks for the introduction and inviting me here. I think democracy has been, as you said, that the buzzword, and all the regimes, whether the communist regimes or even the dictatorships, they claim to be democratic in one form or the other. So I think the democracy as such, though it has been understood in terms of only the political institutions and the political processes, but I think, as you said, that the democracy has much broader meaning and much larger meaning. And Dr. Ambedkar himself was very much concerned about the social democracy as such. And he, as you know, that wanted that the democracy should not only survive in this country, but it also should flourish. And in that context, I think Professor Sarukkai's intervention is very, very important at this juncture. And with these words, I think I would request Professor Sarukkai to make his presentation.
Thank you, Professor Kumar. Thank you, Ganesh, and your group at Speaking from Margin. It's a great honor and pleasure to be with all of you to share some thoughts on the book, and also to have a meaningful discussion with all of you and to learn from your own responses to the larger idea of democracy. I think the questions set out by Ganesh were very useful for me to give a frame for what I wanted to do. So thank you for that, because it gives me a better idea on how to pitch or talk about this book to this audience. And since you said it's primarily it's a collection of students, I think your questions also relate directly to their own practices as social scientists and as students who are working in the field. Of course, it's a great opportunity for me to present these thoughts in front of Professor Kumar, who is a far better expert on these topics than I am. So I very much look forward to his responses to some of the things I want to say. Okay, so speaking from my context of personal motivational experience. So the first question I want to begin with is, what made me write this book at this juncture? And I think this juncture is very particularly important given the politics in the country and what is happening. And we all know the kinds of impacts it has had at very many levels, particularly not just at JNU, but across universities, and not just across universities as such, but also in the way humanities and social sciences have themselves come to be seen. I've been going around quite a few institutions the last few months for some talks and various other things like that. And what is so surprising is to find the kind of negative response to the idea of what is social sciences, what is it to do social sciences, how do you see the people of the social sciences? One of the institutes I was in recently, it's a science institute, and they are telling me, the people who are there tell me that we think social science and humanities faculty are in general a greater problem. So we are very wary of hiring them. What is this whole what is this whole imagination of the social sciences and humanities which has been produced by this government, which has had such a deep impact across levels, starting from school education, since I've been much involved in trying to bring philosophy to the rural areas, particularly in Karnataka and Tamil Nadu, and we can see this reflection all over. So I want to phrase what I'm saying from a larger context of education, also with a larger context of the disciplines of the social sciences and how we are being viewed by the public, mediated by certain ideas from the government and the media. So that was definitely one of the very important reasons to write this book. Secondly, I've been in conversation earlier with people like Romila Thapar. We did a thing on the public intellectual in India, and also at the History of Peace conferences in Calcutta, where the historians joined together to talk about how to look at questions of history in the context of peace and so on. This is the Seagull initiative. And Romila had written a book on dissent, which I'm sure many of you have seen, published by Seagull, which was a way of bringing the questions of dissent to the larger public in a way to convince people. The larger public becomes an important interlocutor because of the worry about how they're being influenced and what one could intervene as academics, as a kind of activism to try and intervene to tell them how to relook at these kinds of questions. So I thought that Professor Romla's book was very important. And when Seagull wanted to have a series of such, they are not academic books as such, but they're also not completely, it's a kind of a serious serious book on topics which would be of interest and reach out to many more people than, like our typical academic books do. And definitely I was very interested in that, and that gave me a forum to come back to thinking about democracy once I knew that it made sense to do it within this context rather than write another academic book particularly. Now, the engagement of the public as a primary goal has also been something which I'm sure many of all of you have been thinking about, and it has been had become very important to me, and it has arisen at different levels. One was, of course, my work with Gopal has been very instrumental in this. After the cracked mirror particularly, we had a series of discussions in various universities and institutions. And we also started an initiative which some of you may know. It was an initiative in the Kannada paper Prajavani, where we were given the op-ed page for 6 months every Monday. It's a daily newspaper in Kannada, very highly read newspaper. And the publisher, Sundar Kumar, we had met him once in a small village in Karnataka. We were doing something there. And we were talking to him about these issues. And he said, I'll give you the center spread for a whole 6 months and you write on these topics. And what we wanted to do was not just for us to write, it was to initiate a public debate on caste and to get various kinds of responses from the field, as it were, and use a very powerful media, a daily newspaper, to try and elicit ideas about what are these questions of caste experiences which happens on the ground and how do we make sense of it. So every week we had a large number of letters which were published. We had a large number of other kinds of things. We used to start off with a small piece on a particular topic. And then we had fantastic, input of various kinds, people from many different walks of life. And Prajavani actually had a digital archive of this. And so the digital archive of it was also to allow social scientists and students in social science to access this very rich material, which was because we couldn't publish all the letters which came to us, which are in thousands. And we thought here was an archive which we would produce from the ground up for people to be able to read and use and so on. But it was all in Kannada, and it was put as a part of the website. So, those kind of initiatives were obviously very important to us. And finally, the real thing which happened, which made me do all this much more easier, was when I started this very informal initiative. It's not a registered organization as the Barefoot Philosophers, where we wanted to take philosophy out to the public and particularly to school children. Because at one level, I realized that much of it came from frustration of trying to tell people about what was happening and their response, particularly the ideological divide had become so strong that it was impossible for us to be able to convince people of different kinds of things, points of view which we think were not, which we thought were very dangerous to society, particularly the views on, social justice and various questions related to that. So as part of it, I thought maybe engaging with children was far more important, and that's how it started a series of workshops on philosophy for children, which is now a book and in different languages. So we are able to access many more students in many areas of the country through this kind of an intervention. So with all these things, I was moving more and more into finding a way to talk about democracy to the larger public. As I mentioned in the book, one of the reasons was also that many of the public discussions discussions I've been having with people in our travels was always about, what is good about Indian democracy. Indian democracy has failed. We should call China to rule over us, or maybe the British are better than this. And, all these kinds of Singapore model is so great and so on. And I think that's fair, and that's part of a public discourse on these things. But how do we actually come back to this question of what is meaningful about democracy in this sense? It is not about making democracy as a political process more efficient or whatever, but what exactly constitutes the question of democracy? And how do we make people respond to the question of democracy in a more meaningful manner, rather than reducing it to a series of political acts, which is what it had become, at least in my view. So, and that is the reason, I was struggling to see what to do. And by that time, I was already writing op-eds in different places, including the Hindu and so on, some of which were very explicitly about questions of democracy and how do we think about a more liberal society and stuff like that. So while that was on, and I felt, given all these reasons, that I felt I had to put many of these thoughts in together, that was actually, in some sense, the genesis of the social life of democracy. I originally wanted to put many of these articles together and build on them and do something. But once I started thinking about it and looking at a framework for it, I found that the only way I was able to do that, I think the real trigger of that framework was, of course, my, when I was doing some of this, I was going through some of other Ambedkar's writings, and suddenly I discovered that rereading that told me that, hey, this is one particular way in which seems very close to me personally as an individual who's always struggled about what is it to be democratic. As when I've been in an institution like earlier at NIAS, the constant struggle has been how do you make an institutional space more democratic? And even when I started my Manipal Center for Philosophy and Humanities, to me the question was, even if I was a director or not, what is the notion of being democratic vis-a-vis students and faculty and the larger community and so on. So that's been a constant thing, always in the background of my mind in terms of my own actions. And then when I found this, I felt that this was the best way to start engaging with this particular question. So that is, I might say, for all these reasons that I started writing this book. So let me come to the second question. How can a researcher deal with the idea of democracy in a refreshing way? When I looked at the question of democracy, the first thing so let me put this framework. And again, Professor Kumar is here and he can also tell us about, a lot more about these ideas of histories of democracy, the questions of political theories. For me, I was going back to this question of what does it mean for an individual to be democratic? And I was very convinced, maybe naively, and maybe I'm wrong, but convinced that, the only way one can be a democratic state, like whatever democratic country, is that if our social life is democratic, that is why everyday life is democratic. Now that's nice to say, but I don't know how. I didn't know how one could make an argument for it. So what I want to point out here is that, although I don't use the word philosophy too much in this book, but I begin from the idea of philosophy. So when you ask how did I deal with this idea of democracy? Writing a book on democracy was just daunting because there's so much about it. Just like writing on Ambedkar, for example, also is daunting because there's an enormous amount of scholarship in these books. And I expect democracy is just too much. There's been a huge amount in global democracies, democracy for the world, etc. And again, I was trying to see how does the talking of democracy matter to the people, the people who are supposed to be the part of democracy. So I went back to my very basic idea of how I view philosophy. For me, philosophy as a discipline is of course important, but it's not as important as trying to tell us of a way of thinking about the world, a way of approaching questions, a way of approaching concepts. So to me, one of the important functions of philosophy is to have clarity in concepts, is to produce clarity in concepts, is to be able to look at concepts from diverse perspectives, to be able to raise questions about the concepts which are not constrained by certain disciplines. So every concept has got a disciplinary boundary around it, right? And that's what the word disciplines itself means. It disciplines the concept. It doesn't let it stray beyond particular forms. And no concept can be held within one discipline. So if I look at democracy within politics, for example, or within history, there are very specific ways by which I engage with democracy. Now, for me, what philosophy does is it allows me the freedom to move across disciplines in a little more easier manner. And that may also be a problem because people within disciplines will feel like you've not done enough about that particular function of the concept in the discipline. That's very fair. But coming from this kind of philosophical idea, where for me, philosophy is to inquire deeper into the concept and look at all its various facets, it allowed me the freedom to move across different domains of this thing. So for me, my dealing with democracy, I don't know if it's a refreshing way, but at least it's a way which I felt most comfortable with. So go back to the question, for example, how do I do that philosophically? First go back to the question, what is this thing called democracy? It's, one of the standard bread and butter questions of philosophy, right? You'll begin with, for example, one of my book itself is titled, What is Science? So we have science as an idea, as a concept. You begin by inquiring into that more deeper. So philosophy of language, philosophy of art, all of them deal with that in some sense. So for me, that was a very useful way to begin with asking, what is this concept of democracy as a set of ideas? And that's why for me, the Ambedkar intervention was very important because it liberated me to be able to take it in a much more broader sense than just saying, very specific forms of democracy or very, very specific interpretations of democracy in terms of certain kinds of political theories or theories in ethics and so on. So once I started looking at it in that manner, then I gravitated naturally from the nature of democracy. What is it that we would call as democracy? It's a very typical question because, many phenomena are duplicated. They look like each other, but you need to find ways to distinguish one from each other. Remember that in philosophy of science, one of the defining moments was the Popperian intervention. It's also very important in the social sciences, where he tries to demarcate science from other disciplines, which seem to claim that they're doing something like sciences. And for disciplines, that was very important. So for me, there are many actions which will be called as democratic. And as Professor Kumar was saying, there have been increasingly many countries that have been claiming themselves to be democratic, including North Korea and China and so on. So is there a way to understand the nature of democracy and thereby look through more deeply at the concept of democracy as a set of ideas? Again, just conceptual ideas. You will see that I use little of so-called, philosophical justification by various writers and so on. I just want to think through with the reader. I want them to think through this question with me and see how can they build their own discourse on democracy. In a sense, this is not about what I want to say. It's about what I can get people to start thinking and saying about what this meaning of democracy is in their own daily lives. Okay, that's the strategy. That's the strategy which I'm entering into this book. So when I talk about then the concept of democracy, I'm sure some of you may have at least have seen this. There is a white paper by the Chinese government on the claim that China is a democracy. It's a very fascinating, long, very readable piece where they make the claim that China is the world's largest democracy. So obviously not India. And there are many reasons that they give for it. Among other things, they don't look at this kind of elections as a very important criteria of a democracy. They look at, questions of the efficiency and the effectiveness of people's participation, effectiveness of improving people's lives as a fundamental criteria for democracy. And they're basically saying, what is the point about whether it's two-party democracy or 10-party democracy, etc. What is the point of just making promises in an election and not keeping it? Therefore, they say things like it is more important to keep your promises rather than thinking about what kind of democracy is in this particular thing or not. So what I was trying to say is that was one of, so when looking and inquiring into the concept and nature of democracy, this becomes a very important point. So you will see in the book then that I go through the process of trying to make sure of what is democracy, the nature of democracy, and then I come to the core idea of how to relook at democracy in the social life. So everyday social, and that is where the basic structure of the book really begins. And then I look at certain other very important concepts for me to understand, which is what makes democracy ethical. And to me, again, as I said, all of this I'm coming from a particular perspective of philosophy, in the sense philosophy as a way of grasping through a particular concept, trying to work through it, and trying to highlight certain kinds of techniques and conceptual domain which philosophy is interested in, such as examples of truth, the notion of freedom, the idea of ethics, and so on. And I was trying to see how those can be brought into a discussion on democracy. And therefore, I have a small chapter on ethical processes, and then I end with looking at truth and the idea of freedom. So again, as I said, the point was not to be for it to be in a refreshing way, but for it to be able to bring my perspective of thinking through it, thinking with the reader, hopefully, in writing this particular book. Now, the larger and more difficult question of how is your idea of democracy different from Ambedkar? There are many points of differences, and I'm sure Professor Kumar would be able to let us tell us much more. And I'm not really doing, as I said, I want to be. Like I mentioned in the preface, this is not not doing scholarship on Ambedkar. As I said, there's a huge amount of work both on that and on democracy. And I was trying to see how do I write a book without getting into this whole question of, a lot of scholarship and referencing and so on, which is something which I found most people whom we have tried to engage with writing react to and say, no, that is democratic, academic forms, and we are not interested in reading it and so on. So the point is, for me, this book had a very different audience and a very different goal of trying to get people to read it. So I struggled with it. It was easy to write the op-eds, because op-eds, I don't do any referencing, but I give some basic points and I write about these things, right? So, which is not that difficult in the context of writing for newspapers and stuff. But when I was going to put together a coherent argument, so to me, that's part of the philosophical approach to the question of democracy. I'm putting or rather the larger academic approach. So I wanted to keep that important function of academic writing, which is to be able to make an argument for your position. Whether that argument is right, wrong, who will agree, who will disagree. That's the nature of academic community. That's what we are all here for, to be able to say, okay, this makes sense, that doesn't make sense. Maybe I should change this, maybe I shouldn't change that. But how do I build a coherent argument? Can I build a coherent argument? That's the fundamental struggle for me. And can I build without actually invoking too many of these scholarly works, which are far better than what I could have written on these topics anyway. So I tried. It was very difficult. I did end up with as few references I could make, because trained in academic writing, it was impossible for me to write a book without acknowledging, look, that these ideas have been mentioned by somebody else, and I want to mention that. I cannot say these things without recognizing at least these one or two points about this, even though I'm coming from a kind of a philosophy of democracy from a different perspective, right, from a different disciplinary function. So I did end with a very minimal, I think, referencing, but that was part of the struggle. So, and also for me, the question of Ambedkar, as I said, was a grand vision for me to be able to make sense of this. So the real coherence in my mind as I wrote it was this very simple argument about Ambedkar about social democracy and the fact that political democracy by itself, in the way we understood it, is not enough, and his point about liberty, equality, and fraternity, which I discussed somewhere in the book, through the book, and the point about whether one should be, does he allow us the space? So there's a very important point about how we look at scholarship also. Since many of you are students, I'm saying this, very often, we have questions about, especially from social science students, who would often ask me, after they do field work and they'll have a large number of things, and then they'll come and say, what do I do with it? How do I write a thesis, right? So in fact, for example, one of my first engagement in social science began right early on after I joined NIAS, when I used to do the summer schools. It's called Summer School for on philosophy for social science and humanities. We would get students from, in fact, my first engagement with a lot of people from JNU and others was from that. People from different disciplines would come, and we would have a whole 3-week, 4-week summer school where we looked at, the use of philosophy within these disciplines and tried to work with students on how philosophy made sense. And that became a larger notion of writing workshops I used to do for ICSSR, the Western thing in Mumbai, where again, for many social science students who are doing their PhD and stuff, we would do some writing workshops, thinking through about writing, particularly about questions of what is writing, how do you do writing, not from the way, for example, English departments would do, but from what I see as a very philosophical perspective on writing. And I thought that was very successful. In fact, for HCU sociology department, I did that for 2 years. So we would do a 1-week complete writing workshop on trying to make students think about the nature of writing, originality, using data to theory, etc., as a series of, something which are immersed in, and we do from morning 9:30 to 6 every day. And it was a fantastic experience with working with these students on that. So this question has to me, therefore, this question about how do you do theory was a very important question. Students repeatedly ask me in all these workshops, and my students at NIAS and Manipal would be like, what is it? I have a large number of data, and I come back, I've collected it after all my field work, and now I'm told that write a thesis, and I'm sitting with all this. What do I do? So one of the typical things, of course, which I'm sure many of you do, is you'll do a literature survey, you go back to many other questions of who is doing what, some literature and stuff, and then you try and make sense of it. Now that's fine. And then the question comes, how do you relate what you have had experience? How do you relate your facts and your experience to what some big writer is saying? If it is, for example, philosophy, using philosophical framework, you would say, how do I connect it to what Rawls is saying, if it's very contemporary, or Kant, or Aristotle, or Plato, or depending on who you're working on. And therefore the question of what does it mean to draw upon a philosopher was a very important question. So if you look at the history of philosophy, what happens is there are many different ways by which we can draw upon writers, who we think have said something important. But one of the most important things about drawing on a writer is to be able to use a writer to develop some vision of yours. There may be points which you agree with, points you may disagree with, points you may want to build upon, points you may want to change. Because whenever a writer has written, for example, typically, even I have seen this even in political science, you may typically go towards a particular author, let's say like Aristotle or somebody, or maybe more contemporary ones, Habermas, Nietzsche, Kant, and so on, and then use them in your own thesis, right? And the question then is, how do you then want to use these people? What is the function of these names within what you want to argue, not within what they want to say? Because when people have said something, they have said it under a particular context. There is a particular social context in which every utterance is made. Every linguistic utterance is presented, produced in a social context. And then for us to be able to directly use it or not use it is, I think, a very important question which I have found students struggling with. And a lot of my work with students on this has been about that. How do you then, therefore, read and interpret and build upon? So there was at one level a challenge whether I could do a lot more on Ambedkar and his writings on this, or whether I, again, keeping with the spirit of the book, in trying to see him as the spirit and the guide which guides my own thinking towards what I wanted to do, and holding on to this idea to say that democracy is a form of government, not just a form of society, and about the mental disposition. That thing really struck very close to me, because what does it actually mean? Why does the idea of mental disposition important for a larger idea of democracy? And what does it actually mean? And of course, this point about fraternity. The point about one of the things about, you can already see that some of the things which I've been writing in this was influenced from many different directions, including the last work on the social, which I did with Gopal, where our argument was about trying to understand the concept of the social and define the idea of social as the primary ontological element, which is the primary element from which the idea of the individual is produced. And that's been something which has been very close to my heart for a very long time in trying to work through many of these questions. And even in the question of science, that has also been a way of which I've been trying to engage with it. And there we discussed quite a bit on the idea of Maitri. In fact, our last chapter on everyday socialism is a chapter on the idea of Maitri and a particular way in which we reformulate it and so on. So that is the context of the idea of democracy I draw upon from Ambedkar. I also try and bring, perspective. So when we draw on other writers, for example, very often we tend to, to bring the larger earlier question, if I'm doing it from a philosophical perspective, what does it mean? How do I read from my disciplinary perspective different writers? How do I read Gandhi, or how do I read various people? I'll give you one example. One of my earlier books was called J.R.D. Tata, The Ethics of Philanthropy, and it was about J.R.D. Tata. For some reason, J.R.D. Tata is the one who started NIAS, and it was his 100th year, and I went to the archives because they wanted some small article or something on him. I went to the two archives in Jamshedpur and Pune, and spent some time reading all his letters and other kinds of writings. And I was very struck by one simple fact, that actually JRD was deeply influenced by the idea of trusteeship. from Gandhi, but from many other things. Even for Gandhi, it comes from many different directions. He also disagreed very strongly on Gandhi, but JRD was very, very repeatedly in his letters and his writings would come back to the influence of the idea of trusteeship on his own formation, on his idea of what business was. For him, there was no possibility of understanding business without philanthropy, etc., etc. I mean, that's, so why I'm using this example is, when I started writing that book, it was not just on JRD. I realized that what I wanted to do was not what JRD had said. I mean, that's there in the archives, and Tatas have published a lot of that. To me, that was not very useful, because JRD is writing letters and stuff. It's a very different kind of a discipline thing. What for me seemed to be important was, how do I build upon the concepts which he's talking about, but which he doesn't open up in full. For example, there's a lot about private and the public, which is present in what JRD is saying. But he doesn't write it like many of us would want to see in our own disciplines. What is the concept of the private? What is the concept of the public? What is the concept of accountability? What is the concept of responsibility, social responsibility? In his actions, you can see it. Tatas were the first to produce a social audit before it was even mandated by the government. The Jamshedpur factory was the first to introduce labor laws, including 8-hour working laws, on their own initiative, which the government of India then brings it into a government law. And why was JRD doing this? And what are the struggles of him? He's a capitalist. He's a businessman. He wants to make his money. But how does this? So for me, that was a good experiment on trying to bring out the conceptual world, which can support such a view. Because when you read it just like that, it sounds very contradictory. But what are the kinds of conceptual ideas you need to be able to support this vision, right? So when I looked at Ambedkar and using Ambedkar in the context of my own sense of saying, how is it possible to argue for the argument that democracy should be part of our daily lives and it cannot be reduced only to its separate things? Because I was very unhappy about the way the society was completely undemocratic. It had completely, people who were supposed to be part of democratic, the so-called we the people, had no access to most of the democratic institutions, whether it's a legislature or even the police, the police station. And you all know this very well. Even the access to the police station, even the access to able to make complaints, etc., are so, unequal. And so all those institutions which seem to support democracy, which is a very important part of a lot of writings on democracy, not just in India, in the global context, institutions that support democracy, also a very important point for Ambedkar, as I'm sure Professor Kumar can tell us. But more than that, for me, his point was about, what does his mental disposition really mean? What does it mean to say that we build fraternity between people and, as a very fundamental bedrock of liberty and equality? And I was very struck by that. And so I said, I was trying to make sense of what could it mean? How can I think about Ambedkar in this particular context? If I wanted to question these points. So my imagination was with people when I tell them, this is the way one should think about it. And I'm talking to people by saying, okay, how do I then do it? How do I bring in mental disposition to be democratic? And I'm giving them a particular kind of argument for it and saying, this is how I want to see, etc. That's the whole point of starting with the family, to institutions, to jobs, and the private and the public. How does that actually work? Okay. So that much of this also, what I've been telling you also covers the methodological, your question on what is your methodological take to cultivate the idea of democracy among public in everyday society. Okay, and so this is of course a challenging task. So what I'm doing is, so I'm looking at how do I then actually do it in a meaningful sense, right? So methodological can mean many things. What kind of methodological interventions one could have. So to me, it was very simple. I was trying to do, if you want to call it loosely, philosophical method, if you like, if you want to call it as a method. In a recent book on methods, edited by Geeta Chadda and Rennie Thomas, on methods, I should be knowing this title because this scientific mapping methods, etc. So it's basically about different methods in different social sciences and natural sciences. So they're trying to really relook at the mapping scientific method in all these different disciplines and stuff. So they have different disciplines from literature, from sociology, political science, physics, etc. All of them writing about very well-known people in India, writing, each contributing a chapter on what is it to think about method in their disciplines. So if you do get a chance, please look at it. It's called disciplinary narrations or something like that. Anyway, I wrote a piece on that on philosophy and method, where I was trying to look at what does it mean to do philosophy? For me, method arises from the point of ways of helping you to do something, right? Rather than just about some theoretical construct. So how, in other words, I was trying to ask the question, how do I philosophically think through these concepts of this democracy and also what Ambedkar was saying? So in a sense, to me, that is the methodology which comes through. And what is that methodology? One, as I mentioned earlier, it is to look at how do I understand the concept, the so-called ideas around definitions, what does it mean to define something, and so on, which is, as I said, a very standard way of approaching philosophical questions. Two was very directly obvious. Once when I set the stage up, I used the arguments about everyday life. So there is a kind of I wouldn't call it phenomenology or experiential in this sense, but something common with much of my earlier work on coming back to making sense of experience of democracy. So one of the points about democracy, when you talk about everyday life of democracy, if you say that people have to be democratic, how do they recognize what is it to be democratic? What is the set of experience that don't just mean sensory experiences? What is the set of experiences that they would think is democratic? Suppose you say you have to behave democratically with your spouse, with your people whom you're working under you, etc. What does it actually mean? How do they respond to that question? So there is a kind of a experiential mode in this. And to me, the experiential mode was important in another context when I talk about the ethical processes of democracy. There I just look at three aspects of voting, trusteeship, and the third one is creating an experience of the public. So part of the question was this, and this was actually a point I'd been thinking about in the context of an earlier piece I'd written for post-colonial studies when Professor Ira Raja and a colleague at DU asked 5 of us to write a response to what is happening with the government's intervention with teachers in DU and other places in JNU and so on. So, Aisha Kidwai, Uday, myself, Arjun Appadurai, and Rose Chowdhury from I think from Jadavpur, we all wrote a piece. Each of us wrote something on this question of what is happening to our context of education in the particular kind of politics within it. There, I wrote a piece for that collection called Voice and the Metaphysics of Protest, and I was trying to understand what does it actually mean to look at the concept of protest and what does one do in the concept of protest. There, when I was doing that, one of the points which really I felt very, what I thought was very important to formulate was the fact that, for most people on the ground, when you talk about the undemocratic practices of the government, let's say, many of them, including not just primarily the supporters, I would say, would not understand what you're saying. They say, no, it's all democratic, we're all functioning, we're all equal, everything is equal, where is the problem, who is being denied what, the same kind of questions. And to me, therefore, I thought it was important to reformulate what the notion of a public space really meant. And in that reformulation of that, I came to the particular view that, a public space is not just a space which allows anybody to just walk in and be there. That's a very important aspect of public space and a larger notion of public sphere. And I'm sure many of you have engaged with Habermasian ideas of public sphere and so on, which seems to be very popular among students, at least, including political science. But I was trying to look at the question of what does it mean to create a public space? And increasingly, for people whom I've been meeting, some very close friends, some particularly among Muslims and others, they were like feeling that India was no longer a public space for them, in the sense that they would say, yeah, there is a park, and of course it's meant to be public and I can enter. But they felt very strongly that their belongingness, their entrance was not explicitly disallowed, but they didn't feel, they wouldn't enter. So what I thought where public space where everybody could enter was never a space of entry. And this is nothing new with what is happening with Muslims as well. There's been a point, it's always been from the Dalit discourse and various other marginal communities about, including about the questions of entry into university space. The point about is to not just say, oh, you haven't, especially after Rohit Vimala and stuff, much has been written. I'm sure all of you have engaged at this point. It's not just to say there's a public space and you can come, but the questions are the kind of production of conditions of a public space. So the way I formulated it is that the most important aspect of a public space is not just saying that there are whatever people can enter, but the production of us conditions which will allow those of whom you don't like to also be part of it. In other words, we have created public space like private homes. So people can come home, and I'll say, but then you only let people whom you want in your home. You can say people you don't want, you say, I close the door. What we've done with many of the public spaces are that these spaces have become ways of excluding, very different ways, people whom you don't want to see, but where only you are present. So I was trying to formulate the idea of public space as a space which necessarily should be a space of difference and protest, rather than a space of coming together. Those spaces are only coming together spaces, are only space of entertainment. They are not public at all. Like you go to a park, you listen to music, eat some food, go to a theater is a public space. Theater is a public space in what sense? It's just for all of us go see an entertainment. That's not a public space in a very genuine way, which we need for a democracy of today. At least that's my argument, part of it. So I was trying to frame this question of the ethics of it. So the methodological question here was also that, a lot of democracy is about right and wrong. Should we be doing this? One person, one vote. Are these institutions working, etc.? But to me, a very important part of democracy is also about not just that, but also about the fact about finding out what is ethical about democracy. And when you ask the question of ethics, it's a very different way of looking at democracy. Not just saying, why should we value individual vote? What is the ethical value in saying I value individual vote in a democracy? And I'm not saying we can't. Please, you have to read my arguments in the book to see why I'm saying that. But very quickly, one of the arguments I use is this. In a society which is completely unequal, in which one person does not have the same value as everybody else, we don't, in fact, there's such kind of discrimination at all levels, hierarchically, socially, economically, within access to basic social institutions. What is this great thing of one person, one vote? As if each of us have the same value. We don't. We live in a world in which we don't have the same value. So while this process of voting, etc., is important, the point about the more fundamental principle hidden behind one person, one vote is producing equal value to all members of a society. That, to me, is Ambedkarite project, not the point of saying, okay, one person, one vote will be voting politically. So that goes back to saying, how am I able to see everybody with same value? Of course, you would say people are each individual doesn't have the same value, obviously, right? Because everybody has different, economically, for example, they may be earning different stuff, etc., etc. I mean, this, that is an important discussion in Marxism too, and how do you pay value for labor and so on. But the point is actually far more important that if you're trying to produce not differences like this, even within that kind of a system where you can pay differences between the kind of work each of us may do, the point is not about reduction of the value of that work which each person does. So that's one way to recover that, right? And there are, we can think of questions around it. But to me, the question is, in the context of Ambedkar's point, how does each of us produce the same value for one person, one value? And what does that actually mean? So what I was asking, the larger question which seemed to me, and this is again a methodological position because I'm coming from ethics as a very fundamental philosophical question of asking, okay, there are many important functions of democracy. We recognize notions of freedom, etc. So two very important points of, if anybody could argue for the ethical stance of democracy, it would be to say freedom is very important. The very idea of democracy. So freedom to express, freedom to dissent, all that we have seen enormously in the public domain. Okay, and we also see how people react and respond to these questions of freedom to express, etc. But I think there are much larger questions about what is freedom, etc. So for me, entering into the ethics, asking the question specifically, what is ethical about the act of democratic? What is ethical about a democratic act? Brings us immediately, allows me a framework to bring the question of democracy into our daily lives and not just into politics. So I can ask about the question of what is the ethics behind the function of, let's say, the director of an institute towards, his or her employees, for example. Or how do I, as a teacher, ethically respond to my students? What is the function? I might want to say I'm a very democratic person, but my students might or might not agree. But what is the function of what I would have to do? What is the notion of ethical thinking that I need to be able to look at democratic action, not just as saying, oh, it's an action in which makes me liked by my students or whatever. You have to do various functions as a teacher. There are various other kinds of expectations. So how do I then start thinking about this ethical functions of democracy? In what way what should I do in order to understand that my actions are ethical? So these are the fundamental thing which, therefore, I did this thing. And the final, I don't know that I should call it a methodological take. It also answers the last question, which is what I'll end with, which is anything else I want to say from the book. I just want to connect all this from what you said, Ganesh, into this last part, which is about, I end this thing about, after talking about the questions of politics and looking at the ethics of voting and so on, because that part is entirely people when we talk about democracy in the public domain, or in many of my workshops, or response to many of my op-eds. So after having dealt with that, I come back to the core questions, and that's where perhaps more of so-called philosophical, direct methodological take is present in them, by looking at this question of truth and the idea of freedom. And to me, both of these are extremely important. I begin with the Chief Justice Chandrachud's talk, where he's giving a talk. He gave a recent talk where he talks about truth in democracy, and begin with that particular point about why does he, when he says truth in democracy is extremely important, truth speaks to power and so on. A point which has been, been very important in the context of truth and democracy. And I wanted to think through this question of what is truth. And, again, one of the essential core ideas in philosophy are these, like one of the core essential concepts is a concept like truth. And again, I'm saying also this because to show what it means to read Ambedkar through a philosophical perspective, knowing that's why I often have this struggle with telling philosophy departments, why you teach various people as philosophers, but what stops you from teaching Ambedkar as a philosopher? Because that is the function of trying to make sense of what writers are doing. When we philosophically reflect on what they do and add up to all the philosophical reflections they have, you actually build a body of work within that particular discipline. So that is also my largest strategy in doing this, in order trying to see. So for example, if there are questions which, let's say Ambedkar may talk about liberty, equality, and fraternity, and one can approach these concepts from a philosophical lens in very interesting ways, and which also matches with many of the things he may say and so on. So I went back to looking at the two core issues which had the most difficulty about truth in politics and truth in human relationships. A lot of theories of truth have been hijacked by questions of truth in science and other disciplines, and we still were struggling to formulate notions of social truth, or truth in social context, truth among personal interactions, and truth in political action. And I remember once, a few years back, I don't know if Professor Kumar was there, at CPS, I had given a talk, can there be a theory of truth in politics? It was a response to the kind of, attack JNU was facing everywhere. And everywhere I went in Bangalore, the first thing they'd say, oh, JNU, this anti-national, and the usual stuff. And I was trying to tell them what I knew of JNU until then, which I'd known from a very long time, and I was trying to tell them what it was doing as education, and it was impossible for them to tell them. They'll always say, oh, that's not true, whatever it is, right? So when I came once to JNU to give a talk there, I said, I told Gopal, I'm going to do it on, can there be a theory of truth? I want to think about formulating a theory of truth in politics. What does it actually mean to do that? And that I did give the talk on some ideas there, and some parts of it was remaining. I had written about it, and I built upon it for this particular book. I tried to write in a very simple manner on trying to tell people, whenever you talk about truth and say this is false, this didn't happen, that didn't happen, etc. It often happens in this government. It's impossible to talk to them to say this is what happened, that's what happened, and they'll say no, it didn't happen. You're just making it up or whatever, right? So what is the kind of way I can talk about the idea of truth? So on the one hand, you had philosophical literature on truth, which was very daunting. It's just like, nobody's going to read it. Nobody in the sense of the larger society with who, unlike other concepts, democracy is a concept of the people. And therefore, I also believe that a lot, some of the very serious theoretical accounts of democracy have also not reached the people whom it should reach. So there is a kind of a tension within the discourse of democracy itself, and it's something again Professor Kumar will have to say more about, because if I'm not able to reach this thing to people to make sense of what I am writing, then is there because this is about that. It's about trying to understand questions of democracy, because in which they already have a part. See, for example, if I write about quantum theory, let's say, as a physicist might do, it doesn't matter whether the people, so-called people, are involved in it to understand it or not, because it is not about the everyday life. It is about a kind of an esoteric discourse that you produce, which only a small community can understand, learn, etc. But insert some of these social concepts, it matters to their everyday life, it matters to their existence. So how do we communicate to them? So on the one hand, we had theories of truth from analytical philosophy, content philosophy, very abstract and stuff. And on the other hand, we had claims of truth. So truth was not, like in quantum theory, nobody on the street is going to say, I agree with quantum theory or not. I agree that I don't agree with your wave particle duality or something like that. They are not talking about us like that. They don't care what's happening. They are not the disputants of your presentation of quantum theory, right? Whereas in democracy, we may produce whatever we want to say about it, but they are the ones who have taken a claim on democracy too. They too have a say and a voice in it. And they repeatedly come back and tell you, no, this, I don't believe in this, I don't think this works, etc. So there is a struggle, I think, in trying to want to bring that thing. So I went back very deeply into the question of truth. And in this chapter, I try and formulate 8 ways of answering these questions about truth and what is so special to truth in the context of politics, in the context of democracy in particular. So to me, that was a very important and difficult, challenging thing. And there you could see why. I mean, one might think the kind of theories of truth we may talk about are not really present. I mean, directly within even within certain kinds of writings on politics and political theory, etc. But there are different ways by which, when we engage with them, we can figure out various ways in which we can think about truth. And I end with one very important point about there are different ways I look at truth, and I end with the ways in which truth are seen to be fundamentally ethical in character. And there, the question of this, and I'm just pointing out, I just read out very quickly, the truths that arise in the act of negotiation are part of a larger class of truths, where truths are understood as action. So to me, truths as action are a very important ways of looking at the idea of truth in not just in politics, but in the social life. And 2 of the best exemplars who define and understood truth in this manner are Gandhi and Ambedkar. And actually, the question of Ambedkar and this idea of truth as action becomes very important in trying to formulate this particular theory. And interestingly, as I'm reading out here, Gopal Guru makes a similar point in a comparison with Gandhi and Ambedkar. He notes that for Ambedkar, quote, being truthful means an ethical action has to be such that it ultimately leads to the emergence of an ethically moral, stable social order. So truthfulness is also a truth performance of a particular kind. It has very deep implications of what we mean, how to live a life. So it's not about how to define a theory of truth, but how to live a life of truth. And living a life of truth is not to say whether some fact is right or wrong according to me or according to us, but actually a particular to act in such a way as to produce an ethically, morally, social, stable order. And if you begin to open up the space by which we look at these concepts, which we take for granted, then it completely opens up our way of looking at democracy itself. And the last chapter was about democracy and freedom, where I look at what I do with truth to a smaller extent I do with freedom, and look at why do we associate so much with democracy and freedom, and is that freedom really freedom that we have? This individual freedom, which is more a consumerist freedom, is it really the freedom that we're looking at? And I'll just end with, I draw a lot from Orlando Patterson's very important work, Connecting Freedom to Slavery. It's a sociological work and not a philosophical work, but it allows me to, quote unquote, very lightly, philosophically reflect on the idea of freedom and what it frees. And so I formulate a particular idea of freedom. And I'll just end with the last paragraph, last two paragraphs of the book, the last page of the book, just if I can read it for a second. So what really is the nature of freedom that is essential to a democratic society? So after going through Patterson and trying to argue what freedom is and what freedom to dissent, etc. mean. So this is what I write. So what really is the nature of freedom that is essential to a democratic society? I began with Ambedkar's call to recognize that democracy is not just a form of government, but a form of society. We have considered the conceptual terrain needed to build on this insight and explore the possibility of democracy as a form of social life. We also noticed that the phrase "we the people" is a problematic term as far as democracy is concerned. But I want to come back to this phrase to recover a notion of freedom that is relevant to democracy. Individual freedom cannot be privileged in democracy because it goes against the centrality of the collective, the people. Privileging the individual in any manner as part of democracy is contradictory to the internal logic of democracy. Thus, the only sense of freedom that is possible in a democratic vision is collective freedom, a freedom that can be only for the people and not for the privileged individuals within this collective. This is a freedom that cannot be reduced to the whims and fancies of individuals. If democracy, unlike other political and social systems that are explicitly hierarchical and exclusionary, has any pretensions that all the people in a democracy have the same value, then it has to find ways to produce collective values and not reduce them to values associated with the individual. And then I just skip a few lines. And the only way we can regroup the people as one entity is by understanding democracy as a way of social life. And it is a recognition of this social life of democracy as the lived, experiential, and moral domain which guarantees Ambedkar's notions of liberty, equality, and fraternity. Paradoxically, this can be done only by investing individuals in certain types of power through the idea of democratic self. Is a democratic self is the one which is infused with qualities of liberty, equality, and fraternity. It is also one that recognizes the fundamental impulse of democracy as actions are always geared to make the worse off better and to make others freer or as free as itself. It is only this collective action by each one of us that can make democracy a meaningful public good. So, sort of I end with those points just to try and put these things together in the context of how I want to view democracy. Thank you so much. I hope it has not been too hurried, but I thank you for inviting me, for being so gracious to listen to some of these thoughts and to having people like Professor Kumar to chair this. And I really look forward to listening to all of you now. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Sarukkai. And I think the way you have already set the tone regarding the book, and you did not talk just about the book, but rather some of the other related books as well. So I think, and other kind of writings that you have been engaged with. So I think the kind of idea that you are coming out with is, I don't think that people have come out with this kind of idea wherein you say that what is the social life of a democracy. And in that sense, I think this work becomes very, very significant, because as we initiated in the beginning itself, that the democracy has basically been considered as the political one, but not the social one. So herein is this intervention actually that you are bringing out, though you yourself accept that the idea basically came from Ambedkar, that how does he look at democracy in the larger social context. So I think therein this work becomes so significant and so relevant. I was just thinking that when you were referring to the context of the book, and then you said that social sciences, the way social sciences are being looked at in, let's say, IITs and so on and so forth. Now it's not only the IITs, I think in the larger society as such also, the social sciences are being rendered to be useless. And I remember that this happened actually for first time probably, wherein Chandrababu Naidu, when he was the Chief Minister of Andhra Pradesh, United Andhra Pradesh, that time he actually closed one of the department, which was the history department. So, so there from onwards, we started that time. So we were students. So we started thinking that is it due to the liberalizing process, which had just started in somewhere in, let's say, 91, but it was in somewhere, I think, 96 or 7. So then now what we see is that the political science as a subject is also being basically looked at as which should focus on the public policy, but not on the larger questions of, let's say, ethics, freedom, and many others. So then what I think your work is basically talking about is that though China might also consider itself to be the democratic, but we need to also understand that why does China claim to be a democratic one? Because if I went to some of the West Asian countries, and therein if you see that the life of the people, despite there being dictatorship kind of or autocracy being there, but the life of the people is the daily life or day-to-day life is much more easier, as well as they have a lot of, let's say, they don't have the livelihood issues as such. The way the democracy in India or many other parts of the world, I think, the people are facing. So in that context, I think this idea becomes important, that what actually becomes, what is significant for the people, whether it is their livelihoods or is it the political freedom as such only. Because freedom, if the freedom is being denied on the political front, but on the social front, or let's say on the economic front, the issues are being addressed by the regimes in power, then I think therein again this issue that what happens to the social life of the democracy there. That is, I think, something which I think I would like to get your response to. Then the democracy and ethics, I think this is something that you have dealt in very, very significantly here. And then I was just thinking that when we started this journey of democracy, let's say somewhere in 17th century or so, then the focus actually remained till early 20th century on the freedom, or let's say liberty. And from liberty, we then started talking about the equality. Equality in many senses, because the liberty was basically in the political sense. And the equality came in the social context and also in the economic context, though it was more in the economic context, if you look at the second part of the 20th century. And I think therein the idea of Ambedkar becomes significant, that he is the one who is also talking beyond this liberty and equality. That is the fraternity. And the fraternity is something that actually Ambedkar thought that this is the probably the way or the process through which the democracy will be going through. And that is what I think the desire of Ambedkar was, that when we become free, let's say in 1947, and then coming up with the constitution, then we will have not only the freedom, but also equality, as well as then it will lead to the fraternity. And that's where the many of the constitutional provisions talk about bringing in various kinds of groups in the larger mainstream society. So I think in that way, what I feel is that the idea of fraternity probably has not been dealt so significantly even by the political scientists. And maybe what I feel is that we probably are stuck in the idea of equality. and freedom generally, as a democratic countries, we feel that freedom has been given, and freedom in the political sense, not in other sense. Let's say you were talking about the freedom of expression and other things, but freedom in the sense of politics, this has been attained. So now we are stuck actually in the equality debate, and equality debate then. Equality debate actually has not gone, let's say, beyond the economy. It has not come to the social, and that's where the social life of the democracy becomes very important. And then I think when you're talking about the truth, you deal very in a big way in your book also about the truth. But I was just wondering that whether truth is a uniform truth. Can there be a uniform truth? And when we look at this, we generally talk about Ambedkar and Gandhi from different points of view. And because their standing made them the way they evolved. And therein, I think the idea of truth, if for Gandhi, the truth is different. For Ambedkar, the truth is different.
Correct.
So how do we then come to let's say one kind of consensus wherein truth can be a uniform one, and the other party also thinks that okay, fine, this could be the truth. And I think then the way you are arguing, particularly in the Indian context, wherein even the idea of freedom is actually being snatched in many ways, and that means actually what I would think is that Ambedkar and other nationalist leaders, they thought that we will be going from freedom to equality, but actually from equality, I think what we are doing is we are getting back to the getting not only back to the freedom, but rather we are drifting away even from the freedom. So emerging inequalities in the larger socio-economic domain, that is one. And in the politics also, the in a way dying idea of the freedom. In this particular framework, if we look at, then are we actually getting back to something wherein even talking about democracy would be difficult, and it is becoming difficult. So then the social life of democracy. So if we look at in this way, then I think the social life of democracy is in a very deplorable form at this stage. And it is I'm talking about the Indian context in particular, but in many other parts of the world also, actually democracy is becoming in many senses useless. Useless in the sense that because the regimes in power or the governments in power, they are not looking at democracy the way democracy was supposed to be. But for them, democracy is becoming very narrow in that sense. And people talk about democracy, but do means just opposite to the democracy. Like if you look at the present in the present scenario, the government of the day, they talk too much about constitution. But when they are talking about too much of the constitution, but when it comes to the basic ideas of the constitution, then we find that they are not bothered about the basic idea of the constitution. So I think I think this larger question wherein democracy, social life, I think, and the way you are raising this question at this point of time, that's what I feel becomes very significant and very important. And I certainly look forward that this this book will produce a lot of debate for the different kinds of scholars, not only in your own discipline, but also in different disciplines of political science, sociology, and also philosophy and psychology as well. So with these words, I would congratulate you for this. And now we can invite the questions from the audience.
Thank you.
Yeah, so I have some comments. So
Yeah, Ganesh.
Yes, please.
yeah, when I was actually reading your book, so from the cover page only, yeah, I think this is the idea of social, what you actually in the cover page. And the interesting thing is that in the back side, most of the book is not in the back side, they are doing anything. That's the interesting thing. In the back side also there is some meaningful sense that how can we understand the idea of democracy. That is the important point you have actually mentioned and raised. That is the interesting thing I actually marked in the book itself. And in that, I also remembered one thing, like when J.S. Mill actually commented on the Indian democracy, like how the idea of substantive democracy, which is not viable for the country like India due to the illiteracy and all this. So one of the questions like how that understanding of the substantive and the procedural democracy you are looking at. And another important thing that is mentioned by you, I would like to read from your book only, how the concept of democracy has actually been undemocratized by the social scientist itself. You have made some points, the 3 points that democracy actually been deteriorate kind of things. So I can read that 3rd point. The theoretical work on democracy repeatedly betrays the undemocratic relationship between theory produced by members of the academic community and the experience of the lay people. It's an interesting point actually I found in your book actually. So there's lots of points, but I don't want to take so much time. That's why, since we have audience to interact with you and questions, I think yes, Vidyasagar.
Should I just have a quick response to both of yours?
Yes.
Respond just to. Yeah, thank you, Professor Kumar, so much for your very kind words and for reading the text. It's always so important to have good readers so that we can continue this conversation. As you correctly said, it's a small starting thing which I've done in order for trying to open up the space of also looking at opening up the space of how we look at Ambedkar in these contexts. And for me, as I said, very important to see him as a philosopher and how do we as philosophers build that edifice around it. Like I said, every philosopher is because other commentators have written upon them, taken up their talk, their concepts and built around it, etc. So I hope, that is also part of my, this one here. Very ironically about the social science in universities, you are right, I've seen it across. But I was saying about my recent encounters at some of the science departments, but very ironically, this just as a side, which I think we should all pay attention to, is that, now increasingly it's a private universities who are supporting. Philosophy was closed in every place, most universities closed philosophy, but all the private universities are now starting it. We now have private universities starting BA, we're paying 10 lakhs, there are 3 or 4 of them in Delhi itself and so many other places, 10 lakhs per year for BA. 1 year is what students are paying. So it's very odd. We say on the one hand, and then on the other hand, it's very clear that the government is worried about social sciences. Absolutely no doubt about it at all. And it's part of a larger scientization of the society. And, that's why my only small complaint about social scientists is that in India is that they should have studied science institutions in a far more robust sociological sense. They've always been on the back foot when it comes to science societies. I mean, J.B.S. Oberoi is one of the exceptions to that thing, but generally within sociology, we are being, put in such a thing, how does we respond to it, in terms of things. So that is one part of it. The question about China and livelihood issues are very important. That's why they keep repeatedly saying, we are giving better life to all the people. So what is this act of voting which makes it better? I think part of the problem is, as the ideal of democracy, as liberty, freedom, etc., has been very important. But I think the problem is that has been used and hijacked by the elite in India, and that's there is no possibility that it is going to help everybody equally. It has helped the elite far more than others in that sense. So that was a discussion which I thought was very interesting to see. There is a long discussion on the China thing, as you pointed out. I just want to say one point to what you said about liberty, equality, and fraternity, because that was something very important, which allowed me to actually proceed further with some of the chapters. When Ambedkar makes such a wonderful point, just for the sake of our students, and let me say just that particular point. When he explicitly points out, that's a point I discussed quite a bit in the book. He points out a very interesting tension between liberty and equality. He says, well, if you privilege liberty, then the question of equality is always going to be challenged. Because you would say individual liberty, why should I be equal to one? I am better than you. You can see this in the whole merit debate, that individuals are better. Where is the question of equality? Why should there be equality, etc.? Those kind of questions. And Ambedkar is very much aware because he makes this explicit point. And he says, if you privilege equality, then the question of liberty gets challenged. To what level should you allow the individual, and if you say this is what the eco-society is. And then he comes to this fantastic observation that it is only fraternity which can bring liberty and equality together. So in other words, you may want to say, I want freedom, democracy as liberty, and social democracy to some extent in the context of society as equality, but these two cannot coexist with each other unless there's this notion of fraternity, the fellowhood, the feeling of fellowhood. This itself was for me such an opening, because you can then analyze it. And, Ambedkar may have written much more. He would have written a book just on explaining this part of it. But, for me, when I look at it from the philosophical angle, he opens up so many spaces. Why is within liberty the act of individual to some extent, and equality is the act of the social in some sense? Why is this notion of feelingness of brotherhood, of fellowship should be important? Look at what is happening. He's introducing the importance of it's not just purely just a psychological thing. It's about a notion of fellow beingness, which has to be essential to the very idea of liberty and equality. And that's why I think those points, and I think Professor Kumar said this very, very, very importantly, why the question of fraternity has to be theorized far more from other social scientists. They should be doing far more about it, because to me, in that, and also Ambedkar says something very intriguing. And I was very worried about writing this section, but I did finally write it, and I'm glad Professor Kumar hasn't pointed it out in any as a problematic thing, but maybe you've been polite not to say it. There's a section on science and democracy where I point out, whenever you have one notion of truth, and it goes back to your next point about uniform, whenever there's one notion of one truth, democracy is a problem, because I am right and you are wrong. That's the discourse which one truth formulates. And for science, it has been a very big problem, because scientifically, even like if we talk about corona, medical science, it is their truth, and nobody else can say anything around it, and we have to negotiate with it. It's not about how do we do it. But the point is, in the context of fraternity, you have to allow this possibility that I'm producing a sense of feelingness, a fellow beingness, right? And how does that actually function? So this. How do we produce those ideas of experiences? And that's, as I said, part of it is to do that. To me, the question of truth is also about that. So I agree with Professor Kumar that there's not one uniform. In fact, the idea of uniform truth itself is a truth which is largely what we call as propositional truths of factual truths, for example. Any truth that says it is true that apple is sweet, that any notion that clause, right? So the truth is not a statement, and that's why I ended the one point of truth as negotiation, truth as action. And then we look at truth because not just of Chandrachud, the very famous piece by Hannah Arendt, whether all politicians are liars and whether lying is very essential to what is the idea of importance of lying in politics and so on, is also the starting point of my analysis. But for me, the question is, if truth is not just about action, then it's always about acting truthfully. And while Gandhi and Ambedkar may have different viewpoints, and of course, I'm sure you're well aware of Gopal's article and other responses to it, but the point is that acting truthfully is a very important aspect of understanding truth. But when we talk about truth, we have reduced it to statements, assertions. But what does it actually mean to act truthfully, and in the context of moral action which leads to a better society, a society based on fraternity? That's, to me, such a foundational idea, such an important idea that we need to take that very deeply into account. And finally, the question about freedom, I go back to this point that freedom cannot be for individuals. We have privileged freedom as individuals for within the democratic thing. It has to be freedom to groups. And this is a point with the Neela Chandra and others have also made, that the difference in Indian democracy is that they have been more concerned about social rights rather than individual rights. And this, the idea that group rights are far more important than just individual rights alone means that's why we could ask points about, various questions about reservation and so on. And that means that if there is a freedom, so to me, and as Professor Kumar rightly points out, now it's even liberty which is being attacked, even individual liberty is being attacked, then it's difficult to talk about democracy. But the only way to counter is to go back to, I think, the Ambedkarite vision, which is what you do is you develop a society based on this fellowship and fraternity and equality of individual feeling and experience, looking at each other as same value. Once you do that, I don't think any political democracy can actually come and overthrow it. We may have problems. I mean, this is very ideal, and I'm not sure, as you correctly point out today, that's why I wrote this book. Today, the situation is so dire. But I think we need to use this occasion to focus on fraternity back. When I look at the kind of alienation which has happened earlier with the Dalit community, etc., now happening with the Muslim community, and across the country, when I'm talking to them and when I hear this, I'm like totally troubled, because these are people who have been very close, who have lived their lives thinking this is their other. This is the land they are in, and they've been now feeling that they are all being marginalized and pushed away, and no sense of being part of this world. I was also in Jamia 2 weeks back giving a talk on something very similar to this, but you could see the kind of way people are thinking about it. That's really saddening and shocking. And the only way we can do to fight these political actions is to strengthen the notion of social life through fraternity, and we have to recoup Ambedkar's very important point about fraternity and come back to it in different ways into our daily lives. And that, to me, that's why the daily life is very important. At that point, I don't think, even though there may be attacks on individual liberty and equality, we may still have a way out. And Ganesh, the point about, this point has also been discussed both in the substantive and procedural, and I claim that, it's not just about mills. There have been claims, even in the Constituent Assembly, that claim that, Indians, again, whether illiterate or not, are not eligible, not good enough to have democracy or to take actions. Even today, if you talk to many of the middle class and other upper class and caste elites, they would still say, the problem in Indian democracy is all these other people are voting, and that they are the ones who are actually running Indian democracy. That's why we are in this situation. So, this kind of an attitude is what I think at one level, definitely the emphasis on the structural elements and the procedural and structural is a way out. You cannot give in to the largeness of the people's views to allow democracy in India. If we had not had the very strong procedural and structural elements which Ambedkar and others introduced, we would not even have been in this position. I don't think we could have. It would have been much more hierarchical, and it only got solidified in various ways. So while that is very important, that's why I come back to this question of Ambedkar's own point about, while these are very important, that you cannot have a flourishing political democracy without the social life. In the social, what you call social democracy, what I'm talking about is a larger lived experience and everyday life of democracy. And the point, you put me in a bit of a spot, the academic thing. I wrote it because I did feel in all, as I said, about my engagements with it. Sometimes, when we do write things, we do write it in ways which does not reach out to the people in general. And that is, we don't have to write everything which reaches out to everybody. That's not the point. But the point is that when this is a subject matter of interest to them, then how much should we be able to reach out to them? See, as I said, if it is something else about something very vague, and I'm writing about some other point about, let's say, nature of scientific knowledge, okay, maybe I'm not that interested. They are also not that interested in that, unless, some of them may be, but not as. But democracy is something which is their own daily life, and we are writing about it. So what is my sense of thing? I mean, it also relates back to many political scientists in India who have written that in spite of so much of experiments and success of democracy in India, global democracy doesn't draw anything upon from Indian writers. And we are never part of the theoretical world vocabulary. And we want to still use those theoretical vocabularies. I mean, anything you start in democracy will begin with Rawls or whatever it is, I mean, yeah, but the point is their experiences are so different. And that point which political scientists have made, and I'm sure Professor Kumar can say more about it, that how is it that we have produced so much of it, both in experientially and in success, and yet global democracy acts as if we are nothing on the map of democracy in terms of ideas. So that is the point, and we are doing this similarly to our own people on how to engage with them, as long as democracy as a concept is concerned. Okay.
Thank you very much. Yeah.
Thank you.
Any other questions, comments? Yeah, please. Vidyasagar, you want to? Yeah.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, you can.
Yeah.
Yes.
So, Ganesh, am I allowed to ask two questions? It's very
Yes.
okay.
Yes.
So, thank you, Professor Sarukkai and Professor Kumar, and thank you, Sarukkai, for bringing this very conceptually loaded and very insightful presentation, and chairs very rightful and justful interventions. So, I have two very experiential account of question which I would like to ask you. First, when you philosophizing this idea of philosophy particularly, and being a student of sociology right now, I would go more microscopic when we understand this idea of social, and what Levro in his work Production of Space talk about the social as a part of the everyday production of your social realities. And if you look at the last 1 decade, where we will find especially the lower caste section, the socially disadvantaged section, they are not able to access the democratic places. For example, the protest site, for example, university spaces, because there are sort of confrontations happening among the traditionally dominant and the non-traditional groups. And the social is very fragmented. What I could say, very differentiated kind of othering is there. And that segregation, that differentiation allows us to build anger among the masses of the lower caste community. And the question is, do you think democracy or democratic institution, because the recent Hathre's judgment, we will take this example, we'll find how the procedural democracy functions when it comes to the justice to the marginalized section. So do you think this social part of the democracy allows to accommodate the anger of the lower caste community? And second, when we talk about the fraternity, I beg to differ to this idealizing the idea of fraternity, especially in terms of solidarity. Whenever either it a case of IIT Bombay's Darshan Solanki suicide, or the girl who sat in the hunger strike in Kerala against her supervisor, or even the other anti-caste social movements, the solidarity only comes with the similar social affiliated groups. So do you think when Ambedkar is saying this idea of fraternity, and parallelly when he is giving the slogan of organize, it seems to be contradiction. Organize means is it like based on social affiliation? But fraternity is a much more liberal idea of organizing. So how do you see this both fraternity, and is it horizontal or vertical? So thank you.
Okay, sure. Thank you.
Shall we take 2-3 questions and then?
Yeah, I see some. Parvez Alam has also asked.
Khushbu is there. Khushbu has also raised. Khushbu, you can come in now.
Yes, sir. So first of all, thank you, sir, for this wonderful presentation. So I was thinking in terms of the reciprocal relationship that exists between social conception of democracy and political conception of democracy. So as I heard your argument, I think you are making a case for social democracy creating enabling conditions for existence and entrenchment of political democracy. But I would like to hear from you on how existence of political democracy plays a role in the project of realizing the project of social democratization and breaking the hierarchies which do exist in society. Yeah, thank you.
We have one question which is in the chat, and it is from Parvez Alam, and it says,
I'll take that. I'll also.
Okay. Okay, you have it. Okay, we have Nikhil. Nikhil can also come in, and then you can respond, Professor Sarukkai.
Sure.
Yeah. Nikhil?
Hello, am I audible?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Thank you so much, sir, for insightful discussion. My name is Nikhil, and I am doing PhD from JNU, And like my PhD topic is all about role of social media in election campaigning, a comparative study of Gandhi, Ambedkar and Savarkar ideas in India since 2014. So my question is related to how social media is making democracy more unsocial, like the work of like Andrew Keen, Bruce Brimber, and like Michael Bosetta. In his classical work, like the weaponization of social media, like cyber attacks on democracy. He says like social democracy is not only threat to the common public culture, but also to the democracy. So, sir, I want to know to what extent social media challenge the social life of Indian democracy, like in terms of popular culture and in public sphere. And second, sir, like you mentioned about the Habermas public sphere concept. Yes, sir, what I observed in last 8 years in Indian democracy, that there is a spiral of the silence theory of public opinion given by the Elizabeth Newman, in which she says that minority accept the majority opinion in order to avoid social isolation, disapproval. So, sir, what is happening last 8 years? Like majority is getting majority opinion is being more propagated, like Savarkar ideas. So, sir, I want to know about your opinion in this. Thank you.
Okay, fine. Thank you, Nikhil.
Okay.
Yeah,
So
please.
should I answer this group?
Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, please.
Yeah, thank you. So yes, Vidyasat, I mean, I think as you correctly pointed out, maybe there are different methodological things in discipline methodologically, sociologically. At least social anthropologically, you might want to go lower, micro levels of different things, and whereas philosophical would be more conceptual. But that's why for me, my fascination is with the everyday social, and the everyday social is actually the minutiae of everyday life. It's about the ordinariness of everyday life from which philosophical ideas begin. And for why everyday life, I always focus on, even in our earlier book with Gopal on everyday social, was because the argument is that much of our conceptual world, which stays with us, begins in our everyday life. In fact, the argument we make in our everyday social book is our first idea of the social comes through our everyday experience in our houses. When I listen to the neighbors, the whistle, the cooker whistle blowing, and the sound of somebody walking outside, somebody selling something, the smell from another person's house. We formulate ideas of the social from these everyday experiences. And I can see this now more and more. That's why I engage more with children now, that many of the things which we are talking about, liberty, equality, fraternity, etc., these worries about democracy, are actually so much inbuilt already at children's level. We think they're not doing philosophy, etc. These concepts have gone into their head. I'll just give you one example. This was in a very progressive village in Karnataka, which has had a long tradition of very liberal values, etc. One of the children in the class was saying, one of the teachers in one of those village schools was telling me once she went to teach and she had got her hair cut or something like that, cut to a shorter size. And the 4th standard kid in the class is telling her, "Miss, you should not cut your hair. It is not, Hindus do not cut hair, like Hindu women do not cut their hair." 4th standard child in a small village, which you would never even hear of if I tell you the name of the village. So this has gone in so deep. In fact, when I did this democracy book, my real aim, what I really want to do, is to rewrite this book as democracy for children, just like I did my philosophy for children. It is then there they need to understand what notions of all their notions of alienation and hierarchies, all are being produced in schools. And we need to take it out and say, look, this is not the way you look at other people around you. And, that is, I think they may actually respond far more greater to that. So I do agree. I'm not saying it's only my approach to philosophy. I'm sure there are philosophy people in India who will say, oh, this is not philosophical. And it doesn't matter to me. They're not even my constituents. I'm just talking about, my everyday life and the people and how we actually think about ideas from their everyday life. So there is but they also make this argument, and you have to take this into account, both political scientists and others, that largely the OBCs, and I'm just casting everything you call as lower caste into this kind of a category, are actually the ruling elite. Today we have their representation as a rulers, the so-called elected thing, is much higher than what it can be. In fact, that's one of the reasons that even Javed Alam points out that it's the poor who are actually running Indian democracy because of they are the ones who are going out in the voting. They are the ones who are mobilizing. They are the ones who are doing all this. The middle class and the upper class have all gone away and just give commentary about what the world should be like. the real participative democracy has gone into very different communities. So the point, actually, you see a lot of anger is actually a very interesting point, because when I talk to some of these more privileged classes, to them the argument is, oh, this OBC and all, their Dalits and others have taken over political space. Who are the people in our MLAs and MPs and stuff? So look at what is happening. It's not we are the ones who are being excluded. So the part of my thing is actually to show them where they are wrong at every step, and to me that is an important project too. So we have to find a balance between that, and then you have this fact, as you very correctly said, there's a larger case of anger, and which has happened, but there's also a large number of cases of what do you call it? Not acknowledgement. There's a word, it's just missing my head. There is, accommodation. They're actually there's a huge amount of accommodation. I was talking to a scholar, social scientist who works with Pasmandar Muslims, and he was telling me when we were talking about what to do about the UP and all, he says, you have no idea what's happening in UP. He says, he's a Muslim scholar working there, and he says there are, a huge amount of support of the Pasmandars to Yogi Nath. So he says they are very closely linked, and we think the Muslim BJP narrative is very different when you look at it those ways. So there are very different kinds of accommodations which are happening. So the question of these anger, that's why this larger question of why are Dalits voting for BJP is coming around so much, right? I mean, what is this phenomena of that? What is, is it just fear, or is there other kinds of things and so on? So there's something very interesting going on there which we need to figure out. And I think the point about solidarity, I agree with what you're saying in general, but that's because of the failed notion. It's not because of the problem it's fraternity as a concept, but fraternity, but rather how we are able to build upon it. And that's why I'm saying one writer or one thinker cannot give the full setup. And that's why we use it to build upon these ideas of, for example, fraternity and Ambedkar. And the idea is that, yes, what you say seems to be true, but I can also tell you, and I'm sure you know this too, whether it was HCU or JNU and others, and with many of the other groups I work with, the kind of support system has come from different communities and sectors too. But the problem is, how do you build a larger notion of, the respect to the other, the respect to the differences of the others, and to know that they have as much a right to anything that one person has. So it is just that notion, which is, I know there have been people who are not Dalits who have been completely devastated personally by what happened to Rohit and others. There is a feeling, the thing, but that's not about sympathy or charity. It's about a sense of, the thing that such things can actually happen in a society which we want to live in. It's something that can be very troubling. But the question is, how do you build it as a community? How do you build it as a social movement? And is there something in fraternity to do it? I don't know. I mean, to me, among all other people, this is the idea of liberty and fraternity from Ambedkar, which seems to be most important to me. And nobody else has been able to build upon it. I mean, Gandhi has a lot of it in some similar stuff, or among other things, not in terms of this question of fraternity and this kind of political insight like Ambedkar has, particularly in the context of inequalities. But what does it actually mean? So if there is other prescriptions, one can look at it to, this anger. I'm saying there is a prescription and there is a way to think through this, to somehow respond to this question of inequality, but at least in the caste question. And that can only be done collectively among all of you and all of us, for us to think through what does it actually mean, and to show models by which it can happen. I do think one of the things about the Indian context is there are been some models in this, but we need to be able to think more. And as a social scientist, the question of experience is a problem, as we know, as a category, which is what we discussed a lot in our Crackman and so on. So to bring questions of fraternity into experiential mode is a problem for social science itself. What does it actually mean? And to say things like fellow being, fellowness, fellowship with others, these seem to be very vague, and primarily because a large amount of social science has been built around a suspicion about individual experience and these ideas of fellowship and so on. We need to recover that for Indian social science and see where that can take us. That's just being very optimistic, but I have to live in optimism about this. Otherwise, it's devastating when we see what is happening around us. And Kushbu, I think your point is very right, that how existence of political democracy. In fact, I would say, even though the idea of social democracy and the importance which Ambedkar pays to that and says about society, form of society is as important as probably more important political democracy. He's also very clear that it's only political democracy which can lead to social democracy, that you need these structural changes, you need these institutions of democracy which can actually enable the first set of conditions. And the point about, like he gives in the Constituent Assembly debate, where he points out the greatest danger to democracy, political democracy, comes from charisma. You have this one leader, you'll have to be very careful, but because they can do whatever, they can destroy democracy, etc. He's recognizing that political democracy is a very important role to play in terms of all that they discuss about, but it is not enough. It is necessary but not sufficient. That you need to build a society which is also democratic. And that's the extension which I'm doing from his thing, to say that it has to happen I mean, I don't know, Ambedkar may not prefer this way of my phrasing it, but I think the extension of it is the only way we as a society we can be democratic is if we function as democratic in our own daily lives all the time. How do I think about being democratic? In my actions with everybody around me. And if that enters into many of us or all of us, there is no way anybody can, disable democracy as a major social movement. That's at least my view. So, Parvez, your question was, there is a contradictory claims of liberal democracy, and is producing contradictory social order. So if we do not acknowledge the permanence and presence of conflict in a social sphere, the consensus building mechanism of democracy is conflict resolving mechanism will remain political and will not be seen as social or economic. Do you see any possibility of engaging agonistic democracy? I think part of the problem of the liberal democracy, I think one of the contradictions, I don't know if you are pointing out to that particular contradiction or not, this part of the problem of the liberal democracy is actually the problem which Ambedkar points out about liberty, equality, and fraternity argument. That is the kind of a challenge which the ideas of liberty have with the idea of equality. That how do you balance both of them, or does one too much of liberty, does it pull down equality, etc.? I think there's something very important there, and definitely I think from what I see, liberal democracy has, in a sense, in many ways, I think it is a very important form of democracy that we have to hold on to. It's almost like what Khushbu was saying; it becomes a condition for producing other forms, perhaps, because you cannot have the laws of liberal democracy, basic sense of liberty, also, as Professor Kumar also pointed out. So it's very important. But what has happened is it has been completely misused to the extent that it has only supported the privileged few. So there are people who have actually benefited a lot from democracy. And that's why in a section I have in the book on voting and the ethical aspect of voting, I point out examples of people paying money for voting and people getting goods for voting. It's become so common everywhere, etc. And when I talk to our people near our house, where many of these are from the domestic labor class, and they are migrants, they live here, but they now do this, and we ask them, and they were telling me that they have a person who will come for elections, and they get typical standard thing everywhere. You can see this at least in South. I've seen it everywhere. I don't know about North. They'll say biryani lunch and 500 rupees, and sometimes with a men water bottle. This was told to me by somebody in Chennai 2 days back. Okay. So that is the standard kind of things. We've seen this everywhere happening. I know places in Tamil Nadu where people go house to house, that voters list, and have paid them money. It has happened in my own relatives' house. They just come, look at a check mark your people, and say, okay, I'm going to give this much money to you, etc. And frankly, they don't even care if you're going to vote for them. They're just doing this. There's a very interesting whole economic model for it. So I'm just writing about I wrote the section on that on the ethics of part of democracy. But when you ask them, they say, well, the standard response is the politician is making money because of my voting for him or her. So what is happening is they are making the money out of my act of voting, and so it is a transaction. You pay me back of it. You pay me for what I am enabling you to get. It is such a good argument, because the politician knows that. What the politician says, how does he decide whether to give 1,000 rupees to everybody or 2,000? His calculation is, I'm spending 5 lakhs on this group of community, I'm getting so much votes, and if I get voted, I'm going to make up that 5 lakhs, or at least 5 lakhs, which I've paid on this. It's a very clear economic transaction which is happening, and both the parties know it very well. So the question is not about whether these people are, in fact, they are the most rational actors in this, in the economic sense of saying, So it is going to this kind of democracy has already led to great inequalities between the ruling class. And here the question of caste becomes far more difficult to handle, because you can have ruling classes become any, I mean, even the OBCs and the Dalits may become very elites, very powerful, rich rulers in the context of the other larger society. So it is in that kind of a contradictory social order that is being thing. But I do believe that the only way of engaging such kind of agnostic democracies is to actually go back to questions of asking the question about everyday social life. To me, I tell you why I go back to this, and not just because that's the argument in the book, but for me, it's so deeply personal. I mean, I look at institutions, and I find that they are run so undemocratically. I look at schools and they are run so undemocratically. And the question I'm asking is, right from houses to schools, you teach everybody most undemocratic practices and action, and you expect them to become political leaders who are going to promote democracy? How is it? Everything that they have learned is what they do. They've just not learned what is it to be democratic with each other. We hear meaning what? Sense of fraternity, sense of fellow respecting each other, notion of producing. That's why when I did mention this, I thought that I've been come. So one of the arguments I make in the book is the only way you have this kind of social life of democracy is by producing a democratic self. And democratic self is very deeply based upon both self-governance and self-respect. And I draw upon both Ambedkar and Periyar to show why the notion of self-respect is what, notions of respect others and respecting oneself is what produces a democratic self in each one of us. And once you have that, we are democratic with everybody, right from our houses to schools to families and so on. Once you build that kind of a structure, I definitely think we will produce a far more vibrant democracy which can handle many of this. Again, this may just be sounding optimistic and ideal, but I do think that a lot more of thought from different kind of people, both critical of this and supportive of this as a community, has to happen. And the final point was the social media. That's Nikhil, I think you asked a point which is very close to my heart, because I've been very, 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 very concerned with digital media in a lot of ways, which is what is running your social media. Digital media has been one of the most disruptive social factors in our society. It is run by a few very, very rich individuals who control, very elite privileged individuals who control much of the world's wealth today. We know how the disparity of wealth has been produced entirely by the technocrats, these large firms, and there is nothing social about what they do. They are completely alienated to the very idea of the social. The fact that all of us have become part of that means that in our everyday social book, the Gopal, that we discuss about the idea of the anonymous social. What the social media has done, like Facebook and others, is to produce a simulacrum, is produce an image of social without it being substantially social in any sense. So Facebook friends, I know kids will say, "Oh, I have 100 Facebook friends." They don't know they are friends because they don't meet them. When they have friends who are physical and who are neighbors and meet them, they have problems with them because they don't know how to deal with them. Facebook friends is easy. You can just say, "Oh, I'm leaving by." With the friends, you have to talk. There are disagreements. You don't know how, they're not going to listen to everything you say. We have completely, and that has been reproduced so much in families, that you'll have children in families who communicate even to their siblings and parents through Facebook and through SMS and digital media or WhatsApp, rather than actually engage physically. The very idea of what it means to be social has been challenged very deeply by digital media. And what has happened within families and friends right from school age has now become part of all our society. We are far more comfortable not engaging with each other. There is no possibility of any notion of democracy in this kind of a thing. People earlier, and remember that we have to remember that social media is run only on purely economic exploitative terms. It's got no other, that's why every time they talked about the social media, they said about Arab Spring, they said this media is what is going to produce democracy in the world. No, absolute nonsense. Because the democracy and the social media and its IP, its intellectual property, its knowledge is held vested in the hands of very few people. Democracy is not that. If it is about really a democratic process, we should have access. That's why the movement open access, attempts by people to start this the non-proprietary software, this common what do they call it? Yeah, shucks, I just missed the word now. All these attempts are to break the monopoly of this few people in social media who control all the knowledge and power of that. And we need to find ways to resist it and do it. So I think this social media people, especially as a scholar in it, you should definitely think of ways to find how you actually, how all these have actually challenged the idea of social life to a very great extent. In terms of everyday life, I'm not forget about politics. I'm taking in terms of everyday human interactions. In terms of psychological interactions, some psychiatrist in Bangalore was telling me nowadays the most maximum number of patients they get are people addicted to social media, and the kind of addictions which come from social media, and the fact that if you don't get up and read a message, you feel that you're lost out. The constant sense of, oh, I have to respond, I have to be behest a call of people whom you don't even know. So there's a very important point about if I'm talking about democracy not just as a political process but as a social life, then we need to really put constraints on this kind of social media and producing that social, in its negative impact on the idea of social life. One of the things you said very importantly is about the minorities accepting majority opinion, and that part of it is only social media, but part of it is also about many other things. Part of it is to say, I can't deal with this kind of blatant brutality, and I'm just going to keep quiet till things get better. And that is happening. And as I said, in more recent times, I'm hearing this many more from Muslims who say that, I'm not going to do this. I'm just going to keep quiet and do what I can. This is the situation there is. And, I'm sure this is a very similar thing you see across caste, definitely. But I think the caste question was a little more diffused in the sense of, for various reasons, both religious and others. So this is a very difficult question. And I think keeping quiet in the face of attack of majority opinion has always been part of it. It's not just necessarily about the social media alone. It's always been part of social processes. And I think the social media has just completely gone out of control, as you correctly say, people being trolled and stuff like that. That's why the best way to handle this, like I do, is I don't use social media. I only use this, what I've been told, is a button phone. No Facebook, no WhatsApp. I don't want to know what people think of me and think of others. It's just too much, right? So we have to, I'm glad you're working on this. I'm sure there's a lot of very interesting things you should be able to get. And I hope you'll do it bravely and enter into it and be critical of it. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you, sir. Thank you, Professor Sarukkai and Professor Kumar. So, Ram, actually, we are in time, so we are sorry for not taking your questions since we are in time. So, thank you again, both of you,
Thank
sir.
you so much. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you so much to our audience, beloved audience, to make a patience and to listen to ours. And also, we have one announcement that on 14th March, we are going to organize a lecture, research method lecture on Gail Ambed and the idea of social science research, which will be talked by Professor Umesh Wagade. Okay, thank you. And
thank you all so much. It's a pleasure. Thank you, Professor Kumar.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much, and nice seeing you.
Yes, lovely seeing you again. Yeah, thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Ganesh and the team. Yeah. Bye-bye.